Our journey begins on the coast at Saint-Nazaire and the mouth of the River Loire. And along the river valley are some of the finest castles, palaces and houses in France. As we head upriver past Nantes, the main towns on our journey will be Angers, Tours, Blois and Orléans. Some of the palaces we will see are enormous and ancient, built over 400 years ago. Many of the castles date back even further in time. At Orléans, we head northeast, away from the river, to end our journey at two palaces. First, Fontainebleau, and then on to one of the architectural masterpieces of Europe, Vaux-le-Vicomte. Saint-Nazaire, on the north bank of the Loire estuary, came into prominence during the 19th century, when the harbour expanded, shipbuilding began, and the railway arrived. The harbour is perhaps most famous for the daring and successful British commando raid during World War II, when an old ship full of explosives was rammed into the dock gates to prevent the use of the dry dock by large German battleships. The Germans used Saint-Nazaire as a base for naval operations in the Atlantic, and inside the harbour is an enormous old German U-boat pen, with concrete an incredible 9 meters thick, which was capable of withstanding any Allied bomb. The robustness of its construction means that even today demolition would be uneconomical. The base is now used by cafes, a bar, and on the roof is an exhibition about the harbour. The Loire is the longest river in France at 1,012 kilometres. It's been referred to as the Garden of France and is flanked by hundreds of historic estates as well as many famous French wine regions that line the banks. Muscadet, Sancerre, Puy-Fumé. The city of Angers lies in the Loire Valley, 3 miles north of the river on a small tributary. The Château d'Angers has a history stretching back to the Romans, who had a fort on the site. The 17 massive towers were built in the 14th century and reduced in height during the 16th century with the stone used for developing the growing town. Further damage was done to the castle during the German occupation of World War II, when a munitions dump inside the chateau exploded. But even with all that's happened to the castle over the years, it's still an impressive sight. An equally impressive sight, and the first of many on this journey, is the Château du Plessis-Bourret. It was built in only 5 years, from 1468, and has been altered externally very little since then. It even has the original working drawbridge. The style of conical roofs is something which can be seen in many of the houses and palaces along the Loire Valley. The river provides water for the fertile valley where farmland and vineyards are interspersed. Large parts of the landscape are also forested, with many of these forests going back to medieval days, when they were used as hunting parks, attached to the different chateaux along the valley. The Château du Saumur stands on the edge of a forest, overlooking the river and town of the same name. It was built in the 13th century and later became the home of the Dukes of Anjou. Over the centuries, it has been used as a military barracks and a state prison under Napoleon Bonaparte. Today, it is undergoing extensive restoration. Another castle is 10 miles to the south on a small tributary of the Loire, the Château de Montreuil-Bellay. The castle seen today dates from the 13th century, with a turreted curtain wall built in the 15th century. During the French Revolution, it was taken over by the new government and turned into a women's prison for suspected royalists. In 1822, it was bought by a rich local merchant who divided the castle into rental units. His daughter then took over the whole property, and her descendants continue to live in the castle today. Standing in the middle of farmland is the stronghold of the Château du Rivaux. The castle was once four-sided, with turret towers on each corner. As the turrets projected out from the wall, they were able to protect the entrance with an enemy trying to get across the drawbridge. Since 1992, the castle has undergone a great deal of restoration. The design of the castle is in a classic 15th century French style, with the aim of showing off the power and wealth of the owner. By the 17th century, styles had changed, and the Château d'Oiron on the southern edge of the Loire Valley has been built as a house rather than a fortress, and the design has been influenced by classical ideas from ancient Rome. At the end of the 17th century, the house was lived in by Madame du Montespan. She'd been King Louis XIV's mistress and moved into the chateau after he'd tired of her. The chateau was then ransacked in the 1790s during the French Revolution and left largely abandoned until it was bought by the state in the 1930s and turned into a very successful modern art museum. On the north bank of the river Vienne, close to where it meets the Loire, is the Château de Chinon. This massive fortress was built in the 12th century by King Henry II of England, who was also ruler of this area of France, which at the time was the separate kingdom of Anjou. King Henry died in the castle, and he and his wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, as well as his son Richard the Lionheart, are all buried in a nearby abbey. The castle was partially restored in the 19th century. At the confluence of the Vienne and Loire rivers is the Château de Montsoreau, built in 1455 as a strategic fortress controlling river traffic along the Loire. Like so many other castles in this valley, it was in near ruins by the end of the 19th century, until it was bought by the local council and eventually restored and turned into a museum. On another tributary of the Loire is the Château d'Azay-le-Rideau. It was built by a rich financier who wished to establish his new nobility. It was designed in the first stirrings of the new French Renaissance style of the early 16th century and sits in a dammed section of the River Indre. The 19th century writer Honoré de Balzac described the Château d'Azay-le-Rideau as bathing in the Indre River like a princely creature. The Château de Villandry is also built in the French Renaissance style and incorporates a 14th century tower fortress. But what marks this chateau out from the others is the spectacular formal garden. Once owned by Napoleon's brother, Joseph Bonaparte, the chateau fell into disrepair and was on the verge of being demolished before being bought by a Spanish doctor, Joaquim Cavallo, in 1906. He then poured an enormous amount of time, money and devotion into restoring the chateau and creating one of the most beautiful gardens in the world. And like many other chateaux of the Loire, it is now a World Heritage Site. The gardens are laid out in a classic formal style, with several kilometres of box hedging. There are all sorts of water features, ornamental flower gardens, and even a vegetable parterre. 10 miles up the Loire is the largest city in central France, Tours. The 12th century cathedral stands on the south bank of the river. It was the arrival of the railway in the 19th century that saw the city revive its fortunes as it began to expand into the surrounding countryside. And in that countryside are some of the hundreds of vineyards that lie along the banks of the Loire. In the Vouvray wine region is one of the oldest vineyards in the Loire Valley, here at the Château de Moncoteau. Way back in the 10th century, caves were excavated in the riverbank to mature and preserve the wine. By the 15th century, Vouvray's fame had spread across much of northern Europe, and the vineyards were cultivated in the best positions overlooking the river. The chateau itself dates back to the 15th century, though it was severely damaged by fire and nearly destroyed during the French Revolution. In fact, going back even further in time to the 4th century, the estate belonged to the Bishop of Tours. Vouvray is made from the Chenin Blanc grape, which can be enjoyed in dry wines, sweet ones, and also in a sparkling version. Due to the abundant acidity, Vouvray can age for quite some time, and also some varieties can be drunk when young. Upriver is the Royal Chateau d'Amboise, which King Charles VII seized from Louis d'Amboise in 1434, after condemning him to death for plotting against the crown. Charles then set about extensively rebuilding the chateau into a favourite of French kings during the 16th century. He also laid out the first formal Renaissance-style garden in France. Like so many other palaces along the Loire, it fell into disrepair over the centuries, and large parts were demolished. But it's still an imposing sight. As is the Pagoda de Chanteloup, the only surviving bit of the now demolished Chateau de Chanteloup. This Chinese-inspired tower is 44 metres tall and, rather like a wedding cake, has 7 tiers. Inside, a staircase allows visitors to climb to the top and look down into the semicircular reflecting pool. The pagoda was built by the Duc de Choiseul in 1775, when he was exiled to his estate for defying King Louis XV. He saw it as a temple of friendship for all the well-wishers who came to see him during his disgrace. This is the Château de Chenonceau, and surely one of the most sublime in the Loire Valley. With the palace built across the River Cher and the arches reflected in the still water, the sheer beauty of Chenonceau has made it the most visited of all the châteaux of the Loire. The main section was built in the 1520s, but was later seized by the crown for unpaid debts. It was then given to King Henry II's mistress, Diane de Poitiers, who improved the house and built a bridge across the river. After the king's death, his wife and regent, Catherine de' Medici, had Diane de Poitiers expelled from Chenonceau by exchanging it for the Château de Chaumont, which we will see later. In the 1560s, Catherine de' Medici would spend a fortune on the house, and most importantly, build a gallery on top of the bridge that gives Chenonceau its shape today. She also replanted the garden in a formal style. The Queen held spectacular parties, often at night, and it's said she held the first ever firework display in France. After her death in 1589, the chateau went through a series of owners, until one of them, in the early 18th century, sold off all the contents. Chenonceau was saved during the Revolution because the bridge was the only one for many miles. In 1913, the Meunier family, famous for their chocolates, bought the house, restored it, and still own it today. And in a final thought, Chenonceau played a part during World War II, as the bridge separated Nazi-occupied France with the French Free Zone on the opposite bank, and was used by many people to escape. Continuing upstream along the Loire is the Château de Chaumont, which Diane de Poitiers moved to after being forced out of Chenonceau. It was built on a hill overlooking the river in the early 1500s in a medieval fortress style, but decorated with some early Renaissance details. In the 18th century, the north wing of the castle was demolished to provide a better view of the river. After much neglect, the state bought Chaumont in 1938, and it's now a museum. 10 miles up the Loire is the town of Blois and its enormous royal chateau, which was a residence of several French kings. The Château de Blois was built between the 13th and 17th centuries, comprising several buildings around the main courtyard. The palace has 564 rooms, each with its own fireplace, 75 staircases, and 100 bedrooms. One of the best-known parts of the palace is the monumental staircase built in 1515. It's covered with decorative sculpture and dominates the central courtyard. At the end of this long avenue is the Château de Cheverny, which was completed in 1650 for the Hurault family. The house has been built in a rigidly symmetrical design, with a roofline which seems to break the building into 5 separate sections. During the French Revolution, the family had to give up much of their wealth and therefore were forced to sell the house in 1802. But they bought it back in 1834. In 1914, the chateau was opened to the public, one of the first great French houses to do so. Children visiting may well feel they recognize the chateau, because the Belgian comic book creator, Hergé, used Cheverny as the inspiration for Marlinspike Hall in his Adventures of Tintin books. A few miles to the north is the Château de Ville-Savin, built in the 1530s for Jean le Breton. The chateau was constructed by the master craftsmen who had worked at the royal palaces on the Loire. This was because Jean de Breton was Secretary of Finance to King François I, and also Superintendent of Works for the hunting lodge that the king was building in a forest 4 miles away, the Château de Chambord. This is perhaps one of the best known and most recognizable chateaux in the world because of its monumental scale and distinctive French Renaissance style. It's a mixture of old medieval forms with new classical ideas from Italy. The enormous roofline is a mass of intricate designs of chimneys and cupolas that almost resemble a skyline of a fantasy town. The project was so costly that it was never finished, and only the central section and north side were completed. So who designed this enormous palace? One suggestion is that Leonardo da Vinci, who had been a guest of King François at another Loire chateau, was responsible. However, there is no real evidence to prove it, and in fact to this day it's still a matter of controversy as to who really was the architect of Chambord. The king spent barely 7 weeks a year at the chateau on short hunting visits, and any visit at the time meant that all the furniture and wall coverings had to be transported, unpacked, and then packed up after the hunting trip finished. Future kings largely abandoned Chambord, and Napoleon gave it to one of his generals, who then sold it. After many owners who tried to look after it, the state took over, and it's now a very popular museum. Today, the River Loire has around 150 bridges across it, many of them historic. This is the bridge at Beaugency, which has a history stretching back to the 14th century. During its long life, the bridge has been extended, repaired, and parts rebuilt. The different shaped arches give a clue to all this work. Over the centuries, floods and ice in winter have caused much damage. War also played its part, because in 1870 one span was destroyed on the orders of the French military during the Franco-Prussian War. In the 1970s, this historic bridge, which was becoming unstable, was completely restored and shored up. Today, the River Loire is navigable for large boats for only about 30 miles. But 200 years ago, the river was an important trading route, and flat-bottomed barges could travel over 200 miles upstream to Orléans. The city is dominated by one of the largest cathedrals in France, Sainte-Croix d'Orléans, which was first built in the 13th century. and then rebuilt in the 16th century after being damaged in war. At Orléans, the River Loire bends to the south, and our journey heads northeast to a royal palace. This is the Palace of Fontainebleau, and the work of many French monarchs. It was begun back in the 16th century and is arranged around a series of courtyards. It was François I, creator of Chambord, who built the initial courtyard. Succeeding French kings then added more. But by the middle of the 17th century, Fontainebleau began a steady decline, as the Palace of Versailles took over the interest of King Louis XIV. During the French Revolution of the late 18th century, the entire contents of Fontainebleau were sold off to ensure it could not be used as a royal palace again. However, within a decade, Napoleon Bonaparte began to transform the palace into a symbol of his grandeur. And it was here, in 1814, that he bade an emotional farewell to his old guard, before going into exile on the Isle of Elba. A few miles to the north is the final destination of this journey, and one of the greatest architectural masterpieces of not only France, but of the world, the Château de Vaux-le-Vicomte. In 1641, a young parliamentarian called Nicolas Fouquet bought an old castle and estate at Vaux-le-Vicomte. 15 years later, he had risen to the powerful position of finance minister to King Louis XIV. And in this position, he was able to amass a small fortune, which meant he could begin construction of what was to become the finest chateau and garden in France. This spectacular achievement we see today was the result of Fouquet picking the best people to carry out his dream. The first was the architect Louis Levaux, the second was the painter and decorator Charles Lebrun, and the third was the garden designer André Lenotre. Working closely with their patron, they were to create not only a spectacular house, but also a centre and haven for leading French artists of the day, all of whom contributed to the beauty of Vaux. For the plan of the garden to work, Fouquet purchased and then demolished 3 villages. The displaced villagers were then employed in the upkeep and maintenance of the gardens. It was said that he employed 18,000 workers to create the gardens at a staggering cost in today's money of around $150 million. All this wealth and influence meant Fouquet had enemies, and they conspired to ruin him. In August of 1661, Fouquet held a spectacular garden party for the king to show off his new house and garden. It was to be his downfall, because it was not a good idea to outshine the king, who had Fouquet arrested for embezzlement and imprisoned for life. Louis then confiscated most of the furniture, tapestries and pictures, as well as all the garden statues and orange trees. He also took the 3 designers, Levaux, Lebrun and Lenotre, and put them to work on his new palace, Versailles. By 1875, Vaux-le-Vicomte was in a terrible state, but luckily for us today, it was bought by a French industrialist, Alfred Sommier, who, together with his descendants, slowly brought the great chateau back to life, so that visitors can marvel at this quite fantastic palace and garden. A perfect place to end this journey. Our journey begins at the island town of Lindau on Lake Constance. We then head west past a series of dramatic castles before arriving at the spa town of Baden-Baden. From there it is east, past the city of Ulm, and then southwards towards Füssen, and on into the Bavarian Alps and a series of fantasy castles. At Oberammergau, we head east to Lake Chiemsee, before heading further east into the Alps and on to Berchtesgaden, and a dramatic house on top of a mountain. Running roughly along the middle of Lake Constance is the border between Germany, Switzerland and Austria. In Germany, the lake is called the Bodensee, and on this island is the ancient Bavarian town of Lindau. It was only joined to the mainland in 1853 when the causeway was built, which enabled trains and carriages to get to the island. This was followed by a new harbour and Bavaria's only lighthouse. In its history, the town has belonged to both Austria and France, and it was only in 1955 that it was finally returned to Germany by the French. Every year since 1951, there is a Nobel laureate scientific meeting in Landau, where prize winners interact with young researchers from all over the world. It was only in the middle of the 19th century that Germany, as we know it today, came into being under the guiding hand of Otto von Bismarck. He unified a series of independent federal states into one country. This was also a period which saw German Romanticism become a dominant movement, and one of its most visual symbols are all the castles, rebuilt in a romantic medieval style. This is Sigmaringen Castle, once home to the princes of Hohenzollern-Sigmaringen. It has its roots back in the 11th century, though what we see today dates from the 19th century. It was built to impress, and became a meeting point for the rich and powerful nobility of Europe. The deep-sided valleys, with rocky crags, gave castle builders an excellent vantage point to site a fortress, and later in the 19th century rebuild them in a romantic style that looked back to earlier times. Perched on this crag is Vehrenweg Castle. There's been a castle on this site since the 12th century, but what we see today dates from the 1830s, when the princes of Fürstenberg inherited Vehrenweg and began remodelling it into this amazing construction. One can only imagine how hard it must have been for the men who had to build it on this high crag over the valley. Since then, the castle has suffered a fire in the 1890s and even an earthquake in 1911, when a staircase tower and some of the battlements suffered cracks and falling masonry. On the other side of the valley is Wildenstein Castle. Begun in the 12th century, what we see today still includes some parts of the original. A narrow bridge joins the stables and ancillary buildings to the main castle on its rocky crag. Castles come in all sorts of styles and sizes in this part of Germany, and many are perched on rocky outcrops with wonderful views. However, this small castle cannot compare to another 20 miles to the north, which is one of the great castles of Europe, and one that can be seen from miles around. Sitting on top of this near 3,000-foot mountain is Hohenzollern Castle. It was built by Frederick Wilhelm IV, King of Prussia, starting in 1850, and it took 17 years to complete. This is another good example of a German Romantic movement castle, built on an enormous scale. The style incorporates the idealized vision of what a medieval knight's castle should look like, though it's doubtful it ever really looked like this fairy tale version. It was also designed to impress and enhance the reputation of the Prussian royal family, who could trace their roots back to the first castle on the site in the 11th century. In 1423, Hohenzollern was besieged for a year and totally destroyed. Only written records tell of its existence. 30 years later, it was rebuilt, and then over the next 3 centuries was occupied by various different countries, including the Austrians and later the French. By the end of the 18th century, the castle was falling into ruins. Only the chapel of St. Michael remained usable and was incorporated into the third incarnation we see today. After the castle was rebuilt, it was not regularly occupied, but rather used as a showplace. It is still privately owned by 2 lines of the Hohenzollern family. Today, the castle has over 300,000 visitors a year, making it one of the most popular in Germany. On a smaller scale, but no less impressive, is Liechtenstein Castle, above the town of Honau. This romantic, neo-Gothic castle was built in the 1840s for Duke Wilhelm of Urach, Count of Württemberg. The design was inspired by a popular historical novel, Liechtenstein, published in 1826. Just as at Hohenzollern, this is the third castle on the site, with the first 2 destroyed in fairly quick succession during the 14th century. After that, it fell into disrepair until it came into the hands of Duke Wilhelm. Some of the lower rooms are carved out of the rock which supports the building. The tall tower was added 50 years later at the end of the 19th century. And the fairy tale castle still belongs to the Dukes of Urach and is a very popular place to visit. 12 miles away is the town of Tübingen, one of the 5 classical university towns in Germany, the other 4 being Marburg, Göttingen, Freiburg and Heidelberg. The old castle is now part of the university, and the 25,000 students account for nearly a third of the town's population. Amongst the eminent students who no doubt walked through these ancient streets was the astronomer Johannes Kepler at the end of the 16th century. And in the 20th century, Joseph Ratzinger, now Pope Benedict XVI. To the west and on the edge of the Black Forest is the spa town of Baden-Baden. The German word Baden translates as to bath or to bathe. In earlier days, the town was simply known as Baden, and the double name only officially came into use in 1931 and was shortened from Baden in Baden, as the town is in the state of Baden-Württemberg. It was way back in Roman times that the healing power of the water was first recognized. It's thought that the Emperor Hadrian founded the town, and certainly Emperor Caracalla came here to ease his arthritic aches. After the collapse of the Roman Empire, the town declined and fell into partial ruin for several centuries. It was only at the end of the 18th century that Baden was rediscovered as a spa town. And in the early 19th century, the resort attracted the rich and famous, including the composers Berlioz and Brahms, and the writer Dostoevsky, who wrote The Gambler whilst gambling himself in the casino. European royalty came to stay in the luxury hotels, including Queen Victoria, Napoleon III, and the German Emperor Wilhelm I. High on a hill overlooking Bad Urach is the old castle of Hohenurach, which was used as a prison during the Middle Ages. Over the centuries, it was feared and hated by the local people, so that when the prison shut down in the 18th century, they climbed the hill and destroyed it. The old centre of Bad Urach is full of half-timbered houses. The same cannot be said of the city of Ulm, 30 miles to the east. A devastating air raid in 1944 destroyed much of the city, but the glorious church was left barely damaged. Even the houses around the square in front of the church, where the market is, were wrecked. The church is large enough to be a cathedral, but as Ulm is not a seat of a bishop, it is known as a minster. However, it is the tallest church in the world at just under 170 metres. From the top, it's possible to look south on a clear day and see the Alps over 70 miles away. Building began in the mid-14th century and was held up several times, with work halted altogether in the 16th. It was only in 1813 that work began again, and the church was finally completed in 1890. "10 miles to the east is Roggenburg Abbey, which was founded back in the 10th century, though what we see today dates from the mid-18th century. In 1802, the monastery was closed down during a period of secularization, and the abbot stripped of his office. In 1986, in a move that comes full circle, the abbey buildings and church have been returned to a new set of monks who are re-establishing the abbey as a thriving community after a gap of nearly 200 years. Our journey now heads south through the Bavarian landscape towards the foothills of the Alps, the great mountain range that acts as the border with Austria and Switzerland. And lying close to the border on the north side of the river Lech is the old town of Füssen. It was the Romans who founded the town here, as it was on a main road through the mountains to Italy, and they needed a base for soldiers in order to guard the route. The town's landmark is the castle, which overlooks the town and is one of the area's best preserved late Gothic buildings. The town itself is full of medieval houses, and the centre remains remarkably untouched. Füssen has become a popular place to stay when exploring the beautiful mountain landscape, as well as two remarkable castles. The first is Hohenschwangau, built on the remains of an earlier castle in 1833 by King Maximilian II of Bavaria and his wife Marie of Prussia. The Queen particularly enjoyed walking in the mountains and often took her two sons, Otto and Ludwig, with her. When Ludwig inherited the throne in 1864, he began planning and building one of the most remarkable fantasy castles in the world, less than a mile away from his childhood home, on the site of another old castle. This is Neuschwanstein Castle, designed as a personal refuge for King Ludwig, who gradually became more and more reclusive. He had become obsessed with Richard Wagner's operas, and in a way, the castle was to be an interpretation of his most famous works, Tannhäuser and Lohengrin. Wagner's music made a lasting impression on the young king, and this is a part of a letter he wrote to Wagner in 1868 about his new, picturesque castle. "It is my intention to rebuild the old castle ruin of Hohenschwangau near the Pollet Gorge in the authentic style of the old German knight's castle. And I must confess to you that I am looking forward very much to living there one day. You know the revered guest I would like to accommodate there. The location is one of the most beautiful to be found, holy and unapproachable, a worthy temple for the divine friend who has brought salvation and true blessings to the world. The cost of the castle was immense and would run to over £100 million today. At various times, over 300 workmen would be employed, and often working at night by the light of oil lamps. All the funding came from the king's purse and the money he borrowed. Costs inevitably escalated, and by the end the castle had cost twice the original budget. One of the reasons for siting the castle here may well have been the view he got from the bridge his mother had built to span the gorge. She loved walking in this landscape, and it must have had a powerful effect on young Ludwig. Sadly, he only spent 172 days in his fantasy castle. Because Ludwig was finally declared mentally unstable and died aged only 41 in 1886. He was later to be known, perhaps unkindly, as Mad King Ludwig. But he left behind one of the most remarkable fairy tale castles ever built, and the inspiration for Sleeping Beauty's castle in Disneyland. As a child, Ludwig had enjoyed hunting trips with his father, and in a valley not far from his home, he inherited his father's hunting lodge. With his obsession for grandiose building projects, he eventually tore it down and built the Linderhof Palace, but this time in a more classical French style, which looked back to his idol, Louis XIV, the Sun King of France. He intended Linderhof, named after the surrounding linden trees, to be like the royal palace of Versailles, but this was never realised, as he later obtained an island on a large lake where his grand plan to match the size of Versailles could be carried out. Later on in our journey, we will see the result. Linderhof may be the smallest of Ludwig's palaces, but it is still an impressive sight. The formal gardens surrounding the house certainly have the feel of the French style of the time. To the north, the sloping ground enabled a cascade to be built, where the flowing water could fall over 30 marble steps and then drop into the Neptune fountain at the bottom. At the top is the music pavilion. On the west and east sides are formal, colourful parterres, with statues, fountains and covered walkways. On the south side, a golden fountain could rise up around 70 feet and stands at the foot of a 3-step terrace garden, leading up to a golden-topped temple. In the park, inspired by the English landscape movement, he had garden buildings put up, including a Moorish kiosk, which he bought in 1876. Needless to say, his extravagance knew no bounds and eventually led to his downfall. Right at the other end of the valley is one of the most important monasteries in the Alpine region, and built on the primary trade route between northern Italy and the city of Augsburg in Germany, Ettal Abbey. The Benedictine Abbey was first founded back in the 14th century, but what we see today is from the mid-18th century and built in the Baroque style. This followed a disastrous fire in 1744, when the Abbey church and many of the other buildings were destroyed. This was the beginning of the Golden Age of Ettal, and in this period the Knights' Academy was established, which developed into a highly successful school. But all this came to an end with the secularization of church property in 1803. And it was not until 1898 that the buildings were bought back by a wealthy Catholic supporter and given to a group of Benedictine monks from a nearby monastery. A mile away to the north is Oberammergau, a town which is known the world over for its Passion Play, performed since 1634. It began because of a vow the local inhabitants made that if God spared them from the plague, they would stage the Passion every 10 years. they were spared, and since then the play has performed in the years ending in 0. The 2010 play involved around 2,000 people and lasted for 7 hours, with performances given between May and October. 60 miles to the east, on the edge of the Bavarian Alps, is Chiemsee, a freshwater lake. It's sometimes referred to as the Bavarian Sea and is a very popular place for sailing and all the other water sports. Those looking for a gentler means of travel might take a trip on the old paddle steamers, which offer a more sedate way of seeing the lake. The lake has a number of islands, and the second largest is Frauenchiemsee. The paddle steamers drop off both visitors as well as those residents who do not have their own boats to get to and from the island. The island itself is car-free and has a local population of around 300 people. Visitors in their thousands come to see the Benedictine convent, which was founded back in 782. To help raise funds for the convent, the nuns make a local drink called cloister liquor, as well as an excellent marzipan. The largest island on the lake is Herrenchiemsee, and hidden in the woods is King Ludwig's unfinished tribute to the Palace of Versailles in France. Unfortunately, Ludwig only spent a few days here, a year before he died. However, the cost of what he did build probably equates to about £70 million today. Only the central section was constructed, as all building was halted a year after Ludwig's death. The section of garden which was completed copies the style of Versailles, with fountains and parterres, as well as a long central alley or avenue which runs right across the island for well over a mile. And as the palace is on an island and only accessible by a small ferry, it has remained in the shadow of Ludwig's best-known castle, Neuschwanstein. But this island palace is well worth the trip for anyone interested in the architecture of the German Romantic movement. For our last destination, we head east into the Bavarian Alps and Berchtesgaden, a place forever associated with Adolf Hitler. His house near Berchtesgaden has been destroyed, but one mountaintop house does survive, the Eagle's Nest. It survives because it was given to him as a present in 1939, but he rarely visited it, and this lack of a close association saved it from demolition after the war. It was built by Martin Bormann on top of a 6,000-foot ridge and reached by a 4-mile private road carved into the mountainside, which goes through 5 tunnels. The cost today of just the road has been estimated at over £100 million. On the other side of the mountain, the road ends at a car park below the house, where coaches deliver present-day visitors. From here, a tunnel leads into the mountain, where a 407-foot lift carries visitors up to the Eagle's Nest. As we climb up to take a look, we discover we're not the only aircraft in the area and decide to give a wide berth to the powered hang glider. The Eagle's Nest is now a small restaurant and bar where visitors can marvel at the view, though as the clouds thicken, it is difficult to see anything. This weather also makes flying dangerous, so this is a good time to end this journey. journey begins in the East German province of Saxony-Anhalt. We follow the river Elbe through Wittenberg, the birthplace of the Protestant Reformation. From an Enlightenment-era pleasure garden at Wörlitz, we discover castles dotted across the countryside from Freiburg to Saarlek. Then it's away from the Elbe and into the state of Thuringia. The famed cultural history of Weimar and the dark past of Buchenwald concentration camp are on our path down the old East-West Germany divide. We cross the border briefly to discover a 200-metre man-made heap of waste salt in the state of Hesse. Then move back to the former East Germany and through the Thuringian forest, Germany's green heart, before ending our journey at the romantic Reinhardsbrunn Castle. The Elbe River has featured prominently in the history of Germany. It's been central to trade and fishing, as well as serving as a natural frontier. The river forever frustrated the Romans, their massive, organised armies always driven back to the Rhine by Germanic tribes. And during the Allied occupation of Germany, the Elbe served as a natural border between the East and West. And situated on the eastern side of the river, in the province of Saxony-Anhalt, is the city of Wittenberg. It was established as a trading centre in the late 12th century, but over the years became renowned as a hub of education and culture. It was here that 16th century monk Martin Luther wrote his 95 Theses, the single act that sparked the Protestant Reformation. And looming over the market square are the twin towers of Stadtkirche, a 12th century church that found itself at the heart of a great religious controversy. Because it was on this site that Martin Luther, back from exile, preached from the New Testament in German instead of Latin. And this is the Schlosskirche, or Castle Church. It was onto the door of this church that Luther nailed his 95 Theses. Today, the city of Wittenberg is a site of pilgrimage for Christians, especially Protestants, who want to get in touch with the roots of their faith. And as we continue down the river Elbe, we come to Wörlitz Park. Situated by the small town of the same name. It's the largest of the English parks in Germany. When Prince Leopold III took a trip through Europe in the 18th century, he returned to Germany influenced by the ideas of the French and English Enlightenment. He sought to supplant the prevalent Baroque garden aesthetic, which was very geometric and ordered, with a new naturalistic approach. Islands, hidden statues and massive palaces rise up out of the woods and lagoons. These man-made structures and works of art were designed to blend seamlessly with nature. The park even boasts the first man-made volcano, as Leopold was deeply inspired by Mount Vesuvius during his travels through Italy. The overriding concept of the garden was influenced primarily by the writings of Rousseau. The French philosopher sought to incorporate nature into everyday life and use it as an educational tool. Schools and houses of worship for a number of religions are prevalent in the garden. Synagogues were built alongside churches here to highlight the religious tolerance of the Enlightenment. And in the centre of a small town near Wörlitz is the Oranienbaum Palace. Architects and engineers were brought in from the Low Countries to create this Baroque-style building and landscape. When Leopold's great-grandfather married into the Dutch royal line, he built this palace and gardens as a summer residence for his new wife. The gardens surrounding the palace consist of Europe's largest orangery, which boasts the most diverse variety of heirloom citrus fruits in Europe. From Germany's heritage to more current concerns. The Saxony-Anhalt region is a leader in renewable energy. 44% of the state's consumption is from wind power. However, most of the country's energy still comes from lignite, a low-grade coal. This derelict power plant in Buldenstein, situated above the Elbe, was built during World War I to supply electricity to the East German rail system in the area. After World War II, the station was commandeered by a Soviet aircraft engine company. Much of the equipment for the power plant was taken back to Russia in the 1950s. This is the jewel city of Bitterfeld and Wülfen. Like many East German towns, the economy here was primarily based on the discovery of lignite and the subsequent heavy industry that grew up around it. Now the industry in the city is geared largely towards the production of solar cells. And running through the town is the A9, which connects many of Germany's major cities, from Munich to Berlin. Many of the east-west highways during the Cold War were restricted and empty. After unification, however, roads like this expanded to become major paths of transit. Like most highways in Germany, there is no speed limit. Now we move westward over vast tracts of farmland into the neighbouring state of Thuringia. The expanse of open fields is interrupted by this massive complex, the Rasnitz Youth Prison. A prime example of the German government's belief in rehabilitation, the prison offers its inmates a second chance. Schools and libraries promote professional study, while greenhouses, workshops and sports halls offer more hands-on experience. Germany's economic boom came from the discovery of lignite during the Industrial Revolution, and the resource has been a major driver ever since. Energy produced this way is a point of serious environmental contention in Germany. This power station in Schkopau pumps out 5 billion kilograms of carbon dioxide a year. Further down the Elbe is the town of Freiburg. Known as the Tuscany of the North, Freiburg is the northernmost wine-growing region in Europe and has been producing the drink for over 1,000 years. The history and growth of the town has been inextricably linked to this hilltop fortress, Neuenburg Castle. It was built in 1090 by a Thuringian count, but has changed hands several times. The Swedes captured it during the 30 Years' War, a conflict over the development of Protestantism. Then it passed from the Prussians to the French and back to the Prussians again. Now it is primarily known as a pilgrimage site for sports enthusiasts, as it is where Friedrich Ludwig Jahn, the father of modern gymnastics, is buried. Now onto the village of Saarlek, which sits beneath two hilltop castles. Built on a limestone ridge to the west, these two towers used to be the core of a much larger defensive area. And on the cliff face to the east sits Rudelsburg Castle, built in the 12th century to protect trade routes. Throughout its turbulent history, the fortress witnessed many battles and sieges. But after extensive reconstruction in the 1990s, Rudelsburg Castle is now a popular tourist destination and the meeting place for Germany's oldest student fraternity. Windmills served as the country's pre-industrial powerhouses for over 600 years. Many have been beautifully restored, like this rotating cap windmill just outside our next stop, the city of Apolda, historically a textile manufacturing centre. Almost the entire city is composed of these Plattenbau, or public housing blocks. Serious housing shortages followed the devastation of World War II. This particular style proved ideal throughout East Germany, as they were cheap and easy to construct. In contrast is Thuringia's farmland, which actually makes up almost half the state. A whole range of crops flourish in these fertile soils, adding to the region's culinary reputation. Nearby is the medieval castle of Dennstedt. Like many of these noble residences, it was devastated during the 30 Years' War in the 17th century. 400 years later, it was commandeered by the Red Army as a base. Today, Dennstedt is in private hands, and investors are considering ways of putting the castle to use, possibly as a sports centre or health spa. In the state of Thuringia, few cities can rival the historic and cultural importance of Weimar. It was here after World War I that the first democratic constitution of Germany was signed. In fact, from then until the rise of the Third Reich, the country was known as the Weimar Republic. The National Convention even sat here in 1919 because Berlin was deemed to be too dangerous due to rioting during the German Revolution. The city even has a literary genre to its name, Weimar Classicism. This came about as a result of the work of Goethe and Schiller, who both spent much of their working lives here. This is the city palace of Weimar. Originally built in the 10th century and modified ever since, it was home to barons for over 300 years. In 1923, it was converted into a museum, which continued through Nazi and communist rule right up to the present day. And at the cultural heart of Weimar is the National Theatre. Established back in 1492, the GDR used it constantly to stage plays, as this was considered a very useful propaganda tool during the communist regime. And the city remains a cultural hub even today. The recently built Congress Centre functions as a New Age counterpart to the National Theatre. It served as a venue for large-scale acts during the 1970s, even hosting a number of Western artists from beyond the Iron Curtain. It was drastically renovated in 1999, in the same year Weimar was declared Europe's cultural city. But Weimar's history isn't all cheery. Just 8 kilometers away is Buchenwald, the first and largest Nazi concentration camp to be built on German soil. Today it serves as a museum and memorial to commemorate the deaths of 56,000 prisoners between 1938 and 1945. The most infamous of the camp commandants was Karl Otto Koch, whose wife Ilse came to be known as the Witch of Buchenwald for her horrific and sadistic treatment of the captives. The diseased and starving prisoners at the complex were also used in mass medical experiments, notably trial vaccines, which led to countless painful deaths. Buchenwald was finally liberated by the American forces in April 1945. Now, moving out of the grim past and westward, we arrive at Thuringia's capital city, Erfurt. Well positioned on a ford across the river Gera, the city became a centre for the trade of woad, a flower used to create a highly sought-after blue dye in the Middle Ages. Erfurt has a special place in the modern German psyche, as it was the location of the first meeting between chancellors from the East and West in 1970. And at the centre of the town is the Erfurt Cathedral. It was here that Martin Luther was ordained in 1507. The building was originally constructed in the Romanesque style for Bishop Boniface in 800. But Gothic additions were built during the Middle Ages. Perhaps the most unique feature of Erfurt is Kramerbrücke, translated as the Grocer's Bridge. This structure has a much layered history, quite literally. After a wooden footbridge burnt down 7 times in the 13th century, a stone one was commissioned. Once this fireproof crossing was in place, houses and shops started to build up along the edges. Now the whole structure is municipal property except for 4 privately owned sections, lost somewhere amongst the clutter. Away from the city, we pass woodland that makes up 1/3 of Thuringia. The region is reputed for its hunting as well as game sausages made from the wild animals found here. And marking the landscape is what's left of the old border which once separated East and West Germany. 1,393 kilometers of fortifications extended along the entire length of inner Germany. Today it's protected as a European green zone, a space for everyone to enjoy. One of the earliest fortified towns in Thuringia is Mühlhausen. It was a major power through the 13th and 15th centuries. But perhaps it is best known for being the chief seat of the Anabaptist movement during the Reformation. The movement rejects the notion of baptism at birth and believes only adults who are old enough to express their faith can be baptized. Thomas Müntzer, one of the leaders of the movement, preached in the Church of St. Mary in 1525. He was later captured and executed in the city. Nevertheless, Anabaptism took hold and is one of the biggest Christian denominations in Germany today. Beech, ash and maple run through Hainich National Park. It is the longest stretch of deciduous woodland in all of Germany. The park is considered a perfect blend of culture and nature and is famous for its sustainable tourism. Now we cross the border of the park into Eisenach. The town began as 3 separate villages which grew into each other over time. Today it is spread out below the watchful eye of Wartburg Castle. Its greatest claim is that Martin Luther translated the New Testament from Latin to German whilst residing here. He worked under the pseudonym of Junker Jorge to avoid detection. Later on, the castle became a place of nationalistic and religious pilgrimage and a symbol of the unification of Germany. Now it's a location for student gatherings and other festive events. Before the reunification of East and West Germany, there were plenty of brutal ways to deter illegal border crossings. Ditches, booby traps, minefields and watchtowers were strategically placed along the divide. This particular tower, the BT-9 model, still stands as a reminder of the Cold War. Prevalent throughout the 1970s, it had firing ports in all 4 walls. But as the fence began to deteriorate in places, savage guard dogs were deployed to defend these open areas. It was estimated that at the height of the GDR, there were about 5,000 dogs defending such gaps. But these days, to cross from east to west, it's as easy as jumping on the highway. Spanning the Vera River is the E40 motorway bridge. Planned and designed in 1940, the project didn't have the necessary funding until 1983. It was a significant undertaking in that it was one of the first joint ventures between East and West Germany, costing approximately $75 million at the time. 732 meters long, it was constructed using tensile steel cables to squeeze the concrete together. Looming over this small town in Hesse is the ever-growing salt hill of Monte Carli. The area went through a boom in the Industrial Revolution, and the discovery of the nearby Wintershall potash mines brought the first industrial jobs to the community. Potash is one of the three main fertilizers in large-scale agriculture. But the process of extracting the usable potassium salts results in tons of solid salt waste. The mountainous landfill started in 1973 and has been growing ever since, now covering an area of 55 hectares. A 1.5 kilometre long conveyor belt transfers 10,000 tons of waste to the pile every day. There are now 150 million tons of waste salt on this mountain, and many tourists climb the 200-metre mound every year. The mine is run by Carli and Salz Salt Works. This facility is the company's largest and one of the most profitable in all of Germany. Although this site sustains about 6,000 jobs, the Vera River, which runs alongside, is now the most polluted in Central Europe. But plans to transfer the excess waste into the North Sea have been finalised, which should help restore the river. Often referred to as Germany's Green Heart, many consider the Thuringian Forest to be the poetic and philosophical soul of their country. At roughly 5,000 square kilometres and dotted with sleepy villages throughout the dense forest, this area has been the inspiration for the likes of Bach, Martin Luther and Goethe. When asked why he chose this location, Goethe replied, "Where else in the world does one find such beauty in such a small place?" And an ideal way to take in the magnificent views over the treetops is to climb the 111 steps of Karl Alexander Tower, which overlooks the small town of Rühle. And finally, tucked away in a romantic corner of the Thuringian Forest, is Reinhardsbrunn Castle. In its 900 years, it's passed through various hands and undergone many changes. What we see today dates back to the 17th century and now surrounded by an English landscape-style park. For centuries, the castle was home to nobles and royalty. It's here Queen Victoria of Britain, on one of her trips through Germany, famously met her future husband, Prince Albert. Reinhardsbrunn serves as a lasting symbol of the German love of architecture and the beauty of nature. A perfect place to end this journey. Our journey starts at Reykjavik, Europe's northernmost capital. From there, we travel to the Reykjanes Peninsula, one of the most active volcanic regions in the world. After paying a visit to Iceland's top tourist attraction, the Blue Lagoon thermal baths, we explore the villages and lava fields of the southwest coast. We then head inland to the world's second largest geothermal power plant at Hengid. We return to the southern coast at Aéreas, one of a number of villages situated on the world's largest post-Ice Age lava field. Out to sea, we explore the Westman Islands, also known as the Pompeii of the North. Finally, we visit Surtsey, one of the world's most important scientific discoveries. Iceland's rich history dates back to the 9th century and the age of the Vikings. It's believed today's Reykjavik was the site of their first permanent settlement. Europe's northernmost capital enjoys one of the highest living standards in the world. With its abundance of renewable energy, Reykjavik is also considered to be the world's greenest city, a great source of local pride. While Iceland remains Europe's most sparsely populated country, roughly 2/3 of its 320,000 inhabitants live in or around the capital. With its commercial shipping facilities, international airport, and striking architecture, Reykjavik has embraced its status as a thriving modern city. One distinctive building is known as the Pearl, a storage facility for geothermally heated water. The location here, a mere 2 degrees south of the Arctic Circle, means short 4-hour days in winter. But in the summer, Reykjavik becomes the land of the midnight sun, with nearly 24 hours of daylight. Swimming is a great way to pass Iceland's long summer days. The use of geothermal pools means year-round bathing. A fine example of the country's unique architectural style is Hallgrímskirkja Cathedral, one of Reykjavik's most recognizable landmarks. At nearly 75 meters, the majestic tower's design was inspired by the shapes and patterns found in lava formations. Of course, no visit to Iceland's capital would be complete without exploring the colourful housing of the city's neighbourhoods. Painting buildings this way goes back to the early 1900s, when corrugated iron was used as a cheap and abundant building material. The problem was that it quickly rusted. So, in resourceful Icelandic fashion, the homeowners looked no further than the leftover paints from boatyards.